Thanks, Amy, and again, Lisa and the whole staff at the library for being such gracious hosts. It's the nature of being a presidential assistant in higher ed that your schedule is not your own. So I'm going to be taking off in a bit, but if all goes well, I'll be back by the Q&A. That's the hope. Born in North Tonawanda, New York, and I note that simply because it's so fun to say North Tonawanda, New York, in 1935, Tom Tredway followed the path of Augustana's first president, Lars Paul Esbjorn, who some 85 years prior made his way from the shores of Lake Erie to Chicago as a way station before heading further west. Tredway's stop in the Windy City was to attend North Park College before transferring to Augustana and graduating in 1957. He then earned his master's in history from the University of Illinois, a Bachelor of Divinity degree from Garrett Theological Seminary, and his PhD in history at Northwestern University. In 1964, Tredway returned to Augustana as a history instructor. He was named academic dean in 1970, and then president, the 7th president of the college 5 years later. During his 28 years as president, new buildings were added to the campus, including a beautiful library, which, since his retirement, has borne his name. Both as dean and president, Tredway worked to create Augustana's foreign study programs, and today 60% of Augustana students include study abroad in their undergraduate college experience. Tredway saw the faculty as the center of the college's educational life. The full-time faculty grew from 113 in 1975 to 141 in 2003, while the percentage of faculty members with the highest degree in their field grew from 63% to 91%. Now, since his retirement, Tredway has done many things in support of the college, but some that are of greatest importance to those of us who are part of the Augustana Historical Society is that he's continued his historical research, resulting in 2 very important books to many of us. Coming of Age, the history of Augustana from 1935 until the beginning of his presidency in 1975, and Conrad Bergendorf's Faith and Work, an intellectual history of the college's 5th president, Conrad Bergendorf. I'm proud to say that these are already signed copies of these, are in the special collections of the Rock Island Public Library, but I'm grateful on behalf of the Historical Society to present 2 more copies to Amy and Lisa so that folks can check them out, take them home and read them. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas Tredway.
We live in Hampton, Illinois, and if you're up the river and you want a free copy of my history of the college, come to the garage door. That baby is selling. This is the time of year when the 50th anniversaries have been observed, and in 2 or 3 episodes I've been involved in this fall connected to the college. I've been involved in recollecting the 50s and then the 1960s. There's an adage about the 1960s, if you remember them, you weren't there. But I was there. And for half of what I want to talk about, I was there. That is the half of Bill Sampson's work at Augustana when he was a student. For half of it, I wasn't, but if you want to know about that half, as I'll say shortly, there is no end of information about his death in Greensboro, North Carolina, 10 years after he graduated from Augustana. Sampson came to Augustana from Richmond, Virginia. His father and his family had had a long connection to Augustana. One of the faculty members at the time that Bill matriculated was a relative of his. The dad had worked on the Manhattan Project during the war as contributing to the development of the American atomic bomb. And then when the Manhattan Project was at least temporarily in Los Alamos dissolved, the family moved to Virginia, where Bill's dad worked for DuPont, a chemical company. When he got to Augustana, Sampson quickly declared a philosophy major and joined a fraternity. By the time he graduated, he had little use, as I'll have occasion to say in a minute, for any fraternities. But the fraternity he joined was enormously helpful to him in the plans that he carried out when he got to be president of the student body at Augustana. He spent his junior year at a program that many American students have taken advantage of at the Sorbonne in Paris. And there, of course, in the late 60s, that would have been 68 that he went to Paris, Bill imbibed the atmosphere of student revolt that was rampant in France and in Germany especially in the late 60s. He read Marx, and he read Lenin, and he read Jean-Paul Sartre, and he developed a disposition and an outlook that was somewhere to the left of what, at any rate, at Augustana constituted the center. I said in a piece of writing I did, while people at home, his fraternity brothers, were reading Martin Luther and William Shakespeare, Sampson was reading Vladimir Lenin. But through his fraternity brothers, he engineered his election to be president of the student body in his senior year when he came back from the Sorbonne. And so he arrived on the campus in September of 1969. I think one of the first things he did was accept Chaplain Swatson's invitation to take a canoe ride on the Maquoketa River with a couple of other faculty. I was one of them, and with a number of students. So I got to know Bill better on that canoe ride one long, late summer afternoon going down the Maquoketa than I had when he had been a freshman and a sophomore. I had, if I can inflict my judgment on you, I had a sense that he was up to something, and it quickly became apparent that he was, in fact. He had resolved that students ought to be in control, entirely in control of their lives except for the judgment of their academic performance at any college or university, whether it was in France or in Rock Island, Illinois. And so he, assisted by some of the other students in the government, in the student government, the so-called Representative Assembly, developed a so-called Student Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. Someplace in the arguments that ensued over that Bill of Rights, the question of responsibilities got dropped, and it simply came to be known as the Student Bill of Rights. It had 17 points, and I won't inflict them all on you. But it was a question of students participating in the setting of admission standards, the matter of entirely free student speech to express their opinions and to invite whatever range of speakers they wished to the campus without any administrative or faculty interference. The insistence that the student government be entirely autonomous with no connections to either to the faculty or the administration, and that the students ought to have control over their own finances. He submitted at least the finances of the student government, if not student charges at the college. Sampson submitted his and the student government's Student Bill of Rights and Responsibilities to the president of the college, asking him for his support, and President Sorensen, who read everything with great care and over again, and was a master of detail when it came to dealing with issues like this, quickly discovered or saw in that 17-point Bill of Rights that point number 8 was going to be the bone of contention for what point number 8 insisted upon, was that the students ought to have control of and be entirely determinative of life in the student dormitories, including the management of the residence halls. So what Sampson wanted was for the student body to, in effect, to take over control of the residence hall. Sampson discovered, had learned from some friends, that there were national agencies which wanted to help students gain their rights as well as exercise their responsibilities through the 1960s. And Sampson discovered there was an attorney in Washington who, at his organization's expense, would come to Rock Island and help him wrest these 17 points, and particularly point number 8, from control of the administration. On Saturday, September 4th, while the Augustana football team played Wheaton down in the stadium, a committee of faculty and administrators and students, led by Bill, gathered in the, of all things, this is called Viking Room. Here were pictures of these homecoming kings and queens, Vikings, Queens. And here in this room, locked up one warm September Saturday, sat a group of about 15 administrators, faculty, and students, your humble servant among them, listening to Attorney Nussbaum from Washington advocate for the students' right to gain control over their own lives and to control and manage financially the residence halls. Sorensen had sensed early on, President Sorensen had sensed early on that was going to be the bone of contention, and he argued in that Saturday afternoon meeting, as I say, while the football game raged down the hill. Sorensen argued that he couldn't agree to that because it would, and this phrase got to be a real bone of contention at that time in the college's life. It would change the nature of the college. He used that phrase over and over, both locally on campus and as some local and even regional TV got interested, he began insistently and persistently to use that phrase. We can't change the basic nature of the college. One of the cynics in the meeting, Tredway, I remember, sat there thinking it's got nothing to do with the nature of the college. It's got to do with the fact that college owns millions of dollars to the federal government on these residence halls. And we weren't positive, that the administration wasn't in any case. I was a member of the history department at the time. I didn't think the administration was willing to trust the payment of that debt to the federal government if the federal government had been agreeable to renegotiating that with the students of Augustana College. But in any case, whether it was unwillingness to change the essential nature of the college or the grim fact that there was this rather heavy federal debt on these dorms, Sorensen insisted that he could not approve the Bill of Rights because of point 8 of the 17. Those meetings were on Saturday, if it matters, the 4th of October. There is a grim symmetry in it, as you'll see when we get to Greensboro, North Carolina. In any case, by Tuesday, Sampson had rallied the student body to him. The enrollment of the college was about 1,800 at the time, and 1,200 of those 18, or 2/3 of the students, gathered in the central campus below the towering Scandinavian American dome and made their way up that ravine, we all called it the slough, made their way up that ravine path that led up to the residence halls and most importantly to the resident hall which housed President Sorensen. They had called the TV station, so as they marched, there are, I suppose if you can dig them out of Channel 4 or Channel 6, still pictures of that march and recordings. One of my friends, a wag on the faculty, loved best of all that if you see those clips, there are students saying, please stay off the grass. Please do not walk on the president's lawn. That was Augustana radicalism in 1969. But Sorensen continued to insist that he couldn't turn the control of the residence halls over the entire management of the student body. A faculty meeting was called, of course, And of course, the faculty decided to defer judgment and action. That was on, I think, Thursday of that week. And they said, we'll meet again. This has happened to me many times from both sides of the lectern. That is, I've been in the faculty and been in the administration. Faculty decided they'd meet again to consider the question a week later. But in the intervening week, Sampson, together with his minions, resolved that what ought to happen is that the president ought to be maneuvered, President Sampson ought to be maneuvered into a public veto of the Student Bill of Rights. And he thought that if he could get Sorensen to veto the Bill of Rights, that would so anger the students that student pressure would eventually produce the passage of the Bill of Rights. But Sorensen was not a large man, and he was not one of the great orators of 20th century American academic life, but he was a tough and determined Nebraska farmer with large farmer's hands and a very careful mind, who was certain that there was no way that they were going to turn these buildings with this multi-million-dollar debt on them over to the student body. As far as the rest of the Bill of Rights, the right for students to express themselves freely without intervention and to invite speakers of their own inclination to the campus, and the other, for want of a term, the other liberalizing ideas that the Bill of Rights contained. Sorensen, who had been a long-time supporter of the American Association of University Professors and had kind of a Nebraska rural agrarian William Jennings Bryan kind of embedded liberalism in his history, Sorensen was sympathetic with it, but wasn't giving up on the dormitories. Sampson thought that any compromise of the Bill of Rights was a sellout. And so better to get this veto from the president on that Bill of Rights and on point number 8 than any kind of compromise that might have watered down the 17 points. The students resolved that they ought to contact the board of directors first in a series of individual meetings with board members, one-on-one, when the board came to the campus, as it did 3 times a year, and it just happened by chance, as it were, that there was a meeting scheduled for late in the month of October. So the students collared the board members one by one, but quickly discovered that the board were entirely sympathetic with the president. They didn't want to change the essential nature of the college either, and they backed the president to the hilt. And letters began to pour into Sorensen's office, and most of those letters from the community and the region and from people in higher education were supportive of the position that Sorensen had taken. The students resolved that what they ought to do now was to send out letters to prospective students telling them not to attend Augustana. It was a Pleistocene, or at least medieval, operation where students were not accorded their rights and the responsibilities that were due to them. So the effort was made to undermine the college's position that way, but that effort seemed not to work either. Finally, one more time, they decided they ought to go up the hill and visit the president's house. A vigil was called, this time without concern for the lawns. It was November by now. The grass had turned brown, and the students sat all over the front yard. President Sorensen had been out at a meeting, and when he came home, he drove up. He and Betsy Brodall, the dean of women, each had Buicks. And Sorensen came up to his house in his Buick. He and Mrs. Sorensen climbed out. I mean, it wasn't a Cadillac, so, you know, the man was inclined toward capitalism, but not Cadillac. Sorensen parked his car, and then, as the college paper said in one of the great phrases of Augustana journalism, Woody, that Sorensen's baptized name was Woodrow. He never went by it, but we knew him, began to call him Woody. Woody grinned his snarky grin and retired to his house with no comment. The rest of the year was spent, I think it's not unfair to say, by the students being angry, but feeling entirely thwarted that what they had asked for was not going to be granted because of this point number 8. And when graduation came, Bill Sampson, who was an excellent student, had been elected to Phi Beta Kappa, but he rejected membership. Yeah. His name is in the Phi Beta Kappa book at Augustana, where the new members are asked to sign, but then it's crossed off with a little notation, withdrew membership. Turned down Phi Beta Kappa and resolved to go to seek the answers of all places in a divinity school. He enrolled at Harvard Divinity School in the fall of 1970, and completing the course of studies there in 3 years, earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree. When he got to Harvard in the fall of 1970, right after having just graduated, he wrote Woody a letter, it's in the archives, addressed Dear Woody, saying, I hope you give up being a fundraiser and turn into an educator. And then, again, this phrase, if not, I hope and trust the coming years will be extremely difficult for you. He, as I say, finished seminary, but gave up on religion and the ministry and resolved to go to medical school. He was a good student and had taken enough science that he was admitted to the University of Virginia Medical School. But there he fell into the company of radicals. Virginia Med School and the medical school at Duke University, just south of the state line in North Carolina, had a number of people who were sympathetic with the farther left in the range of American political ideas at the time. He fell particularly under the influence of one of the professors there, a James Waller, Jim Waller as he came to be known in the movement. And after 2 years, Bill dropped out of med school at Virginia and decided to go into organizing labor. He joined an organization that Waller had belonged to, the Communist Workers' Party, which was somewhere to the left of Russian socialism. They were Maoists in the language of the 60s and 70s, which meant, among other things at least, that they regarded Soviet communism as a hopeless compromise with capitalism. The Russians were buying and selling materials to the Germans and the French, and any kind of truck that a real socialist had was, with those kind of people, those capitalists, was a compromise. They resolved that they would move their activities to Greensboro, North Carolina, a town about the size of the Quad Cities. I think the population today is close to 300,000. Up in the northern part of North Carolina, not far from the Virginia state line. And they resolved that they would, the so-called Communist Workers' Party, this Maoist organization, would commit itself to organizing the textile workers in the Greensboro textile mills. You can find as many versions of this next series of events, friends, as suit your taste. And I had occasion in another talk I gave a couple weeks ago where I said I'm at the age where I'm entitled to quote myself, so I will here again. The first thing that happened, if you put on one set of spectacles to look at this, is that the Communist Workers' Party decided they'd try to organize the white workers in the textile mills who were not interested in anything with the word communist in the title. The group changed its name to the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, WVO. And the Workers' Viewpoint Organization then resolved that it would seek to organize black workers in the textile mills and began to have some small success. Their great opponents were, of course, the Ku Klux Klan, which was having a kind of renaissance or revival in the South, in the American South at that time. And the WVO, the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, was emboldened by its success in breaking up a couple of Ku Klux Klan meetings in the Greensboro region. One such meeting was going to screen sympathetically the American movie producers W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, this silent, talky movie. I saw it as a kid, a student, I think at Augustana. But in any case, it's a movie that's deeply sympathetic to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and has an extremely negative depiction of Reconstruction era American black life. In any case, they had broken up a showing of Birth of the Nation. So the Workers' Viewpoint Organization was feeling its oath and scheduled for the morning of November 3rd, a Saturday, in Greensboro, in one of the black neighborhoods, scheduled a Death to the Klan march. If you, I haven't brought a bunch of slides. I thought I'd let Bill Sampson hover over our considerations today. If you go online, you can find pictures of some of the materials that the Klan spread. They were tough, but so was the material that the WVO spread, Death to the Klan. There was an effigy of a Klan member at the march. The little kids who participated in the march were pounding on the effigy. Some of the WVO members had pistols, and one of them, Jim Waller, the organizer, the leader of the march, this erstwhile med school professor, one of them, Jim Waller, had a rifle in his car. But the Klan, far from being intimidated because of the breakup of their Birth of a Nation film event a couple of weeks earlier, the Klan had resolved that this time they were going to take the challenge that the WVO offered them. The WVO material said, for example, the Klan must be beaten back physically, eradicated, exterminated, wiped off the face of the earth. And, of course, the Klan members responded to that kind of rhetoric. They appealed to another group whom they knew was rising to some influence in North Carolina, the American Nazi Party. And so you got this strange hookup of the traditional Southern-based North Carolina Ku Klux Klan with a party that had its roots in an ideology that many of these Klan members had in their younger days been sent to Europe to fight against. You got a hookup between the American Nazi Party in North Carolina around Greensboro with the Ku Klux Klan. And they decided they would respond to the invitation from the WVO, from the Communist Workers' Party, to show up at their November 3rd, their Saturday morning march, in the Morningside neighborhood of Greensboro, this area where black folks tended to live in Greensboro. The Klan and their Nazi, now partners of all things, said time is running out, we have got to save American society. Segregation in the South had been outlawed. There had been a number of job losses to American black folks, and in some cases even it had moderate ring to immigrants who were moving into the South, at least into North Carolina at that time, and a profound sense of bitterness on the part of the Klan-Nazis at being left out of the prosperity that seemed to be spreading in some sections of American society, supported and abetted by a government which opposed segregation, that is, which opposed the Southern way of life. The other thing that agitated the Klan Nazis was, of course, that this WVO was a mask for a communist party. people felt, some of us remember well, about communism, the way people get today if you say ISIS is moving to Milan, Illinois. People were profoundly agitated by the communist aspect of the whole thing. So on that bright Saturday morning, where it was still fall in Greensboro, North Carolina, 9 cars of Klan Nazis drove to the Morningside neighborhood in Greensboro. Approximately 40 men were in the cars, some Nazis, some Klan, and they were armed with rifles. A 10th car followed them at a little distance, followed this cavalcade of 9, and that car had a number of local police, a couple of local police, and an informer who had wormed his way into the Klan organization in Greensboro, and who for $50 a tip was giving the police information about what the Klan, with their new Nazi allies, had in mind. So at some distance, but following, with full knowledge of the violence that the Klan planned, came this car with a Greensboro policeman. Otherwise, or 2 in it, 2 in it. Otherwise, there were no police present in the Morningside neighborhood that November 3rd. These people jumped, the Klansmen and the Nazis jumped out of the car. They had long-range rifles, and they shot dead on the spot 4 members of the demonstration. Jim Waller, the medical doctor who had been so influential in Bill Sampson's radicalizing, a second physician who had been who had organized a clinic for poor folks in the region, certain Michael Walker, Cesar Calche, who had been organizing workers in the Duke University Hospital. I mean, he was a labor organizer, this fellow Calche, whose sister today is, a strange twist, the president of the University of Washington in Seattle. Here and there, but he came from an academic, intellectual family in any case. A young black woman who was a teacher in the Greensboro schools, but who was sympathetic with the cause of the Workers' Viewpoint organization, and of course, Bill Sampson, Augustana class of 1970. Bill had been working, had given up on med school, had been working in the textile mills himself, seeking to organize the poorest of the workers in the mills. Within 88 seconds, because there were TV cameras present, I mean, they knew something was coming, even if the police pretended they didn't. In any case, within 88 seconds, 4 people were dead, and the 5th, Dr. Walker, died 2-3 days later, I think 3 days later actually, in a local hospital of his gunshot wounds. Sampson had been trying to give cover to Waller, at least some accounts say, that is, was going for the weapons that the WVO had brought with them, and was shot twice through the heart, so he was dead immediately. The next day, the Iranians took American hostages on November 4th, a Sunday morning. And so the news of the Greensboro massacre absolutely got obliterated with the single-minded focus of which only American television networks are capable. They dropped the Greensboro story almost entirely, and I remember when I got interested in these matters thinking, gee, I don't remember hearing much about that at the time. I mean, Sonia Knudsen, a friend from the faculty, reminds me that in our church service that morning, the pastor that Sunday morning announced that Bill had been killed the day before, but so quickly did the whole Iranian situation overtake the country and its attention that you didn't hear much more about it. 3 trials were held, one a year later in North Carolina, a state trial, in which an all-white jury acquitted the easily identifiable shooters. The movie cameras, the TV cameras had been there. 4 years later, in 1984, a federal Department of Justice action under President Reagan had brought charges. Again, an all-white jury acquitted the shooters on the grounds that it wasn't the jury's purview to deal with the expression of political views. They refused to address it as a racial issue. And in 1985, that is about 5 years after the event had occurred, a federal jury awarded damages to the families of the dead. A total of $350,000 was awarded to one person, Dr. Nathan's Dr. Walker, I'm sorry, a widow, and she was a person who's still around, and speaking about this, shared the money with the other families. In the 2000s, that is to say, decades later, Greensboro, still feeling some conscience about this matter, a group of citizens led by local clergy resolved that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission ought to be set up in Greensboro to deal with the episode. There was tepid support at best from the Greensboro community, from the political and social and economic leadership of the town, but the commission did meet and finally agreed that a monument to the dead could be erected. The Communist Workers' Party proposed and eventually succeeded in having put on the monument these sentiments. On November 3rd, 1979, the criminal monopoly capitalist class murdered Jim Waller, Cesar Cauce, Mike Nathan, Bill Sampson, and Sandy Smith, with government agents, Klan, and Nazis participating. Heroically defending the people, the five charged gunfire with bare fists and sticks. We vow this assassination will be the costliest mistake the capitalists have ever made and the beginning and turning point of the class struggle in the United States. These men were the strongest, these men and the women were the strongest leaders of their times. Their death marked an end to capitalism in North Carolina, when workers suffered untold misery, yet as a whole remained dormant for lack of leaders. In 1980, the deep capitalist crisis has begun. The working class is awakening. The CWP5 lived and died for all workers, minorities, and poor, for a world where exploitation and oppression will be eliminated and all mankind freed for the noble goal of communism. We will overthrow the rule of the monopoly capitalist class. Victory will be ours. Fight for revolutionary socialism and the rule of the workers. The Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission found that rhetoric rather strong, but agreed that in a black cemetery in the Morningside neighborhood of Greensboro, where four of these people were buried, the four men, the woman was taken to her home farther south and buried, Sandy Smith, that such a monument could be erected. One of the questions that arose from that reconciliation hearing is kind of where, if I can end up quickly here, where I kind of want to wrap it up. One of the Reconciliation Commission members asked this question: is there reconciliation in the truth? That is a tough, tough statement. Is there reconciliation in the truth? They knew what had happened, that these five people had been gunned down. They had had guns too, and they had certainly carried on insightful rhetoric, starting with the death of the Klan and the urge to exterminate and wipe the Klan off the face of the earth. But was there going to be reconciliation in the truth? And between these two episodes, this one small little episode at a small college in downstate Illinois. And this profoundly disturbing glimpse into how life was in Greensboro, North Carolina, 10 years later. Between these two episodes, there are some remarkable parallels, and just in conclusion, let me reflect on them. One, the profound ideological orientation of the folks who are bringing the protest. I don't want to put it on one guy. Bill Sampson would be profoundly upset if he thought Tredway, the sellout, who became a dean administrator, was talking about him in a small Rock Island library outpost 40 years later. But Bill was a profoundly ideological person who was unwilling to look at the possibility of compromise. One of my colleagues in the history department spoke often of the fact that Bill had a two-value logic. That is, you were either with him or you were against him, and there wasn't anything, any place, any middle ground where people could meet and compromise, a two-value logic. The rhetoric of the Communist Workers' Party, or the WVO, was certainly, the rhetoric was as violent as the rhetoric of the Klan and the Nazis had been. And that's, you can read the materials and I think you'd agree. But the question that's raised is about the relationship between verbal and physical violence. And that, again, I don't have the answer to. But the question is, what about the relationship between verbal exhortations to violence and the performing of violent acts? Because that's what happened in Greensboro that day. And I have to say, too, there is on the part of whether it was the student government at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois in the 1960s, or whether it was the Communist Workers' Party in Greensboro, North Carolina in the 1970s, there is a kind of admirable but difficult naivete about power relationships. There's a tendency to underestimate your opponents. Forgive the editorializing, but did Bill think? I remember sitting there, those warm September afternoons, thinking, does Bill think the college is going to give him the dorms to the student government? I mean, again, with this honking, monstrous debt hanging over those dorms. You had to rent those rooms or the feds would declare the college in default. Did they think that having broken up a Birth of the Nation film showing a couple weeks earlier meant that the Klan and the Nazis were discouraged and that their will and that their inclination to meet violence with greater violence was broken? There was a tendency bordering on naivete to underestimate the commitment or the position of the opposition. And finally, an article in Politico online, you can look it up if you're interested, go to Politico and look up Greensboro Massacre, by two American journalists, Sean Sale and Peter Keating, says this is the beginning of the alternative right, the rise of the alternative right in American political life. They got away with this, and it emboldened them. But it's equally arguable, if you want to put on a different pair of spectacles, to say it's the beginning of the profound polarization that afflicts the society to this day. It's not the beginning, but it's certainly an important step leading to the kind of polarization that we deal with today. And we're left with a troubling question from whatever side of the matter you sit on politically, the troubling question that a member of the Greensboro Reconciliation Commission had asked. Is there reconciliation in the truth? Is there reconciliation in the truth? or if you want to get along, then you got to give up some of the things that you believe most deeply in. Well, that's Bill Sampson. And those are 2 episodes. One, in the grand scheme of things, fairly trivial. The other, not so trivial. Thanks. I don't know if Ty's back. He said he was coming back, but like the Savior and like MacArthur, I shall return, but so far no sign. Are there questions? Yeah.
I'm Bill Bork. I was
We know you.
class of '72.
Right.
I knew Bill very well.
Yeah.
And the question is, and my wife was on the Representative Assembly for a number of years up until her graduation in 1973. Was there not later on, either in '72 or in '73, an adoption of an amended student bill of rights and responsibilities? And you're right, people forgot about the responsibilities part and just focused on the rights part. How much of what was in the original points ended up in that document that was ultimately approved and included?
Yeah, certainly not point number 8. I will confess to having read that amended document once, but having forgotten some of its prose. It was, by the time it was adopted in '73, I don't want to be offensive, it was not a dangerous document from the administration's point of view. By that time, having already begun the process of being purchased out, I was the dean of the faculty, so not negotiating. I remember I didn't think there was anything. If you sure invite the speakers, go ahead. The question of control, it was clearly left in that later recension in the hands of the college, including the finances of student government. I mean, the ultimate responsibility was in the hands of the college business officers. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi. So we're all class of '68. Kind of beyond documents or things that can be written down, is there any kind of enduring legacy that you see at Augustana 2019, or that I know you're somewhat removed from Augustana 2019, and maybe somebody else knows, that is reflective of Bill Sampson and his spirit?
Well, maybe some of the folks that are here want to speak to that, please.
I could speak to it. I was a freshman when Bill was a senior, and his first cousin was my roommate. I didn't even know there was a Bill of Rights. All I remember marching for, which I was a radical, I guess, was we had rules like you had to be in on the weeknights at 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock on the weekends, and you had these little recipe cards, you signed out. If you didn't sign in, which I always signed in, but I had friends that didn't, it was bad. Yeah. So that got eliminated at the end of the year, and I think for me, that's what I remembered marching for. Like, I don't want to sign this card just to walk down to the library or whatever. So I think that came out of it for sure that year.
Did you walk on the grass?
I don't remember that.
Yeah, Bill. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's Donovan.
Yeah, I'm Donovan Larson. I'm class of '72 as well, and Bill's a friend of mine as well. In defense of Bill's worldview, he did come across as being rather black and white, but his leadership required that he be a little bit more black and white maybe than the way he felt. He was a strong leader I was 2 years younger than him, and when we camped out on Woody Sorensen's lawn, we weren't quite sure what we were ultimately going to live and die for, but we felt like there was a freedom that wasn't available on the campus that was worth at least making a point. And being as how Vietnam was the event of the day in those days, and given the fact that French students were a few years ahead of us in their efforts to demonstrate against the war. Bill came back with that in his head. And although he didn't become a Vietnam activist, he became an activist for student rights, pretty much with the same concept of pushing real hard in one direction and hoping that other people would come halfway. And when he worked in Greensboro, North Carolina, and was organizing the workers in those garment districts, he was, again, calling himself a communist. But what he was really doing was he was filing successful grievances and making their lives better in those garment factories. And when they called a death to the Klan rally, I doubt that they had in mind killing Klan members. I think that their point was to the workers in that Morningside neighborhood that there was strength in organization, and that by being able to stand up and say, this is a death to the Klan rally in North Carolina, which was an extremely racist town. Two of my relatives taught school there. That they could make a difference in the strength of those people working in that garment factory. So I think that Bill had a feeling for what he was capable of, and I think that he showed the side that was most strident because it got the greatest attention. But he was a tremendous leader at Augustana.
Others? Well, thanks very much for listening. It's good, especially to see.
Nice job.
It's good to see so many of you that I remember fondly from your student days. Thanks a lot. Yes, please.
I just want to say one thing about truth and reconciliation,
Yeah.
which is what we're struggling with today
Aren't we?
in our culture. And it seems like there's no path to even acknowledge what is true.
Yeah.
I mean, someone was probably having a feeling about what it is, but it's so muddled out there.
Well, I don't want to inflict my views on you. I've said that twice already, but allow me one more time. In the case of Greensboro, there are pictures. I mean, and what the picture shows, these Klansmen, Nazis, shot down 5 people, 4 to death that day, and 1 died 3 days later in the hospital. They also show that there was an effort made by the WVO to respond, but they didn't have the firepower. Now, you know, we had a debate about whether the greatest crowd that ever attended an inauguration attended one 3 years ago in this country. Well, there are aerial photos. Unless they were hiding, there weren't as many folks there as there had been 8 years earlier. I mean, that's back. You know, Pontius Pilate was the guy who asked, what is truth? Yeah, there is such a thing. Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is such a thing. And I'll give my commercial. Okay, I will. One fact, my friends, one fact in the history of this country is that a considerable segment of the country has been left out of the claims and rights that the country claims to give to everyone. That's just a fact. So, yeah. When 14% of the folks, that's a fact. Others? I don't mean to squash your question. Please, sir.
Yes. How did his life and then his death change your worldview and made you move forward from that?
Oh my.
And you know, your path through the college and then to the administration.
Well,
you look at that as kind of an aha moment? There are things I need to question and maybe change?
I guess I didn't quite share the views of Bill that some of his brothers in the fraternity and in the student government shared. I did think Bill was a true value guy. And I thought that the maneuvering that I was present at and the attempts to move Sorensen into a position of vetoing, and the sense that better to get him to veto than to get the rest of the Bill of Rights but give up .8, that's how it looked to me. And I resolved to be a cop-out compromiser. And as long as you're asked me, thank you for the invitation. My theory of administration, for what that's worth, administration isn't worth having theories about, but if it is, it's to listen in stereo. It's to listen in stereo. When somebody's telling you something in this ear, or on the other side, somebody's telling you the opposite, you ought to listen to both of them. I try, for what it's worth, I mean, at this late stage in my life, I'm still trying to listen to both sides, but I have a tough time right now, truthfully. Because I think the truth tilts in one direction rather than the other, but I don't want to push my bias on you anymore than that. Yeah?
Yeah, I appreciate the last sentence you shared about the truth of representation in the United States and access to resources and just representation in general. And then what you just said just now, and for some reason those kind of stand out as a little bit different from some of the sentiments I was hearing you express, at least between the lines during your talk. And yeah, for some reason I was made to feel kind of uncomfortable listening to you talk.
I'm sorry.
I think
maybe I'm
part
not.
because it seemed that, yeah, again, between the lines you were kind of describing some, maybe not blame, but like that the folks who were killed kind of had what was coming to them kind of sentiment, and that they incited, right, the Ku Klux Klan to come with their words, and you talked about how about words and about action. And yeah, you talked about polarization and how polarization is this really bad thing. And so I guess like hearing you say what you just said about, you know, listening to both sides of the stereo, and yet how there is one side that leans toward truth, do you not think that polarization has a function to it, is my question. And I say that as someone who used to think polarization is horrible and that we need to be able to come across and I think a friend of mine a few years ago, I was having this conversation with him and he was like, well, sometimes polarization is very necessary. So like, let people reflect upon where do they really stand when it comes down to these issues that are, whether it's, you know, making our world inhabitable for future generations, or if it's providing, you know, resources for everyone like they should be provided for. Yeah, so do you actually think polarization is a bad thing?
Well, you and I, like great vessels in the night, are passing one another because, as you suggested, while you came to the view earlier that polarization ought to be avoided, you changed your mind, so have I. But I changed it in the opposite direction. I think that the polarization that threatens our society right now, and this is supposed to be about Bill Sampson, the polarization that threatens us now, nobody made me Arnold Toynbee. I mean, I'm not entitled to make pronouncements about the sweep of world history. But if I got a little card that said, oh, try it for 3 minutes, I'd say the kind of polarization that affects us now has affected other societies at other points in human history, and many of them have not survived that kind of polarization. Friends, look, I guess most of us went to school in this, the greatest country that has ever existed. Come on. I've lived in Britain, and I've lived in Sweden, and I've lived in Germany, and I've lived in Canada. You could move 800 miles north of here, and my wife's going to tell me shush. And believe me, 95% of your time, you wouldn't know the difference for 15 minutes. But if the society doesn't have some commonly accepted values that it adheres to and that it tries to extend to all of its members, not 90% of the members, all of them, then the society, here's where the Arnold Toynbee stuff comes in, forgive the pretentiousness, it isn't going to hold up. It isn't going to last. And if we cannot find some common ground, if we cannot manifest some willingness to listen to the other people and ask what's going on there, how can they think that? I mean, I say that to Kate 5 times a day. How can they think that? And then I try to figure out how they can think it. What's going on there? Doesn't mean I like it. Well, that's enough of me. But if you disagree with my move, power to you, do it. I mean, power to you.
So it's up to you, Dr. Trump.
Oh,
No, we've come to the appointed hour, and well, I would say that this is the largest crowd we've had in quite a few years here at the Frieze Lectures. So I would entertain a motion of the House that we make Tredway a fixture in every series.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going over to the ER right now. That's all I got.